Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. What a fabulous story we have tonight, and I'm sure you agree it's an amazing story. A young girl goes back to the hometown where she was born. She seems to have been divinely led to this place that holds so many memories, very tragic memories for her father, who is now residing in Australia. But he's in Australia and she's decided she wants to buy the old house that her parents initially lived in, where she was born on the kitchen floor. So let's see where this story is going to take us, because I'm quite sure it's going to be on quite a trip. So before we go any further, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. And let's get started with part 3 of our story tonight. Well, I think it's wonderful, Alicia, that you're fixing up Primrose Cottage. It's been an eyesore around here for long enough, and no one's done a thing about it, which is an awful shame if you ask me. Believe it or not, it used to be the bonniest cottage on the street, enviably so. But old Dorothy Edge, she was a notorious hoarder, you know. She allowed the place to quickly descend into decay. But, Mum, Primrose Cottage is a sorry sight now. But it's got good bones. Oh, but it has, Lily agreed. Very good bones. It's structurally sound, and there are no leaks in the roof. So my bet is that once you fix up the cottage, Alicia, it'll be a showstopper once again, like it was back in its day. I'll say this, though. I think you've got a lot of work on your hands. But good on you, love, for taking such a daunting challenge on your plate. Your mother would be proud of you, you know. When she saw Primrose Cottage all those years ago, she fell in love with the place. It is very good to have a young person such as yourself moving to our small town. All too often, I'm afraid to say, the young folk around here go off to seek their fortunes elsewhere, in New York or other big cities. But you're coming here. Well, it's fabulous news, very refreshing. What is it you do for a living, my dear, if you don't mind my asking you? Of course I don't mind your asking, Lily. I'm an open book, so to speak. I just work for a regular company in New York. I write articles for them, newsletters, reports, and so forth. I'm lucky because I can work online from home. So I don't have to go into work. I only have to touch base a few times a year, with my boss, that is. So I'm very lucky. Well, that's very good news, said Lily, rubbing her slim hands rather gleefully. This modern-day technology is changing people's lives, is it not? She said, looking genuinely thrilled that Alicia had come back into their lives again. I'm glad you're staying in my cottage for a while, Alicia. I've got so many stories to share with you about your late mother. She and I were the best of friends, you know. You should have seen her when she fell pregnant with you. She shouted it from the rooftops that she was having a baby. There was no secrecy with her whatsoever. She was so delighted. And when you were born, there wasn't a day that went by that she didn't have the biggest smile on her face. I'd never seen her so pleased as she was after you were born. She told everybody about your delivery, on the kitchen floor, of course. It was all over town, that story. All of a sudden, Lily's face paled, almost as if a rather unsavoury thought had just crossed her mind. Good Lord! Does Mr. Tanner know you're in town, Alicia? No, Mum, he doesn't, said Kitty, answering for Alicia. If you must know, he doesn't know anything about Alicia. Well, not yet. And I think it should stay that way, don't you? I mean, if he learns that Ruth Beckett's child is in town, it'll open up some painful wounds for him. He's suffered enough already, don't you think, Mum? And knowing Alicia's back, well, it might rub some salt in the wound. He always blamed himself for what Tommy did, when it was never his fault, was it? How was he supposed to know that Tommy would go joyriding that day, causing pandemonium everywhere? It was all a dreadful accident. Of course it was an accident, Kitty. Don't get so defensive, love. Everybody knows that. I don't dispute that for a single second. But I'm not sure that you can keep a secret like this from the Tanners for very long. That's all I'm saying. For a start, people talk in our small town. Mrs. Silver Carraway, for example, is quite the gossip. She's the very worst. If that woman learns about Alicia, the secret will be out, let me tell you. She's got about as much tact as a rhinoceros. If I know her, she'll be slamming on the Tanner's front door, telling them Alicia's in town. She certainly loves to stir that pot." "Oh dear," said Alicia with an unfortunate sigh. "I don't want to think my presence in town might upset people, especially the Tanners. Like you say, none of what happened to my mother was Mr. Tanner's fault. So I hope he doesn't blame himself." "Never you mind, dear," said Lily kindly, putting a reassuring arm around Alicia. "Don't you dare fret, my girl. I guess sooner or later the Tanners are going to have to find out the truth. Silver will see to that, I'm sure of it. And there's not much we can do about it. That woman is a garrulous chatterbox. I do know that Mr. Tanner visits your mother's grave at the cemetery to lay down flowers for her every week. He's a very good man, you know." "About the cemetery," Kitty interjected. "Alicia didn't even know her mother was buried at the local graveyard. Nor did she know that the Tanners paid for her gravestone. She thought her mother was scattered out at sea." "Oh, good gracious me! Where did you get that idea from? Your mother would have hated that." "But Dad said my mother loved the sea. I automatically assumed that what he was saying, that he scattered her ashes over the water there." "Yes, your mother did love the ocean. That was true enough. But she had strong views on being buried, you know. She said she'd never, ever want to be cremated. She liked the idea of being buried in a pretty graveyard. So she got her wish fulfilled, I'm very glad to say." "She told you that?" asked Alicia, looking somewhat flawed. "My mother was a young person. She was a little older than I am now. It's hard for me to conceive what I would want to do with my remains when I die. I don't even think of things like that. It's so morbid thinking about death, don't you think? And when you're young, it's not a subject that really crosses your mind. Until much later in life, I rather suspect." "You make a very good point, dear," said Lily. "I'm just trying to think about how me and your mother got on to the subject of how she wanted to be buried. It is rather curious. Oh, I remember now," she said, a light going on in her eyes. "Your mother was telling me she was going to a funeral in New York of an old friend of hers called Helen, who died tragically from a diabetic episode. I think Helen had been born with type 1 diabetes. Your mother was sitting at the kitchen table in absolute tears. She couldn't believe that her best friend Helen from New York had died. She was so upset about the whole thing. But she told me that Helen wanted to be buried, and she wanted to make sure that her wishes were fulfilled. Anyway, that was when she began to discuss her own mortality. That was when she told me that if she were to die, she would definitely want to be buried. She hated the idea of being cremated. She thought that would be the most dreadful thing to happen to her body. She liked the idea of being buried in a pretty graveyard, surrounded by flowers and trees. So we got her wish fulfilled, because I was able to tell your father exactly what she wanted. So she never had to be cremated. And that's one thing I feel very happy about." "You don't think my mother thought she might die young, Lily, do you?" asked Alicia. "It just seems rather extraordinary to me that she would talk about how she wished to be buried. It's strange that she would bring all that up, don't you think?" "I can't answer your question, love. I really can't. Whether your mother had a sense of whether she would die young or not, she must have kept that to herself. Although I do agree with you. It is profoundly strange for your mother to go into detail about how she wanted to be buried. Who knows? Maybe she did know that she would have a short life." "Well, maybe she wasn't conscious that she'd die young, but deep down inside herself, maybe she knew she would," said Alicia. "Who knows, dear? You really must go and see your mother's grave at the cemetery. I'm rather surprised your father never told you about it. I'm even more taken aback that he gave you the impression your mother's ashes were scattered at sea. That was very naughty of him to tell you that." "Well, maybe Alicia's father didn't want her to know about her mother's grave," said Kitty. "Why ever not?" asked Lily. "Surely he'd understand that Alicia would want to pay her mother's grave a visit at some point. I mean, if my mother died at a young age, and I'd never known her in life, you can bet your bottom dollar I'd visit her resting place rather regularly. And if my father kept such important information from me, well, I wouldn't be impressed with him, let me tell you that." Maybe Alicia's father didn't want Alicia to come back to this town, said Kitty firmly. I can understand his reasoning in a manner of speaking. Maybe it was just too traumatic for him, and he wanted to draw a line in the sand and forget about what had happened to his late wife. I guess he didn't want Alicia to come here, or to visit the graveyard, for it might reopen all the wounds of his grief. Nobody likes to be reminded of the tragic things that have happened in their lives, do they? People want to forget about them. Maybe that's why her dad went off to live in Australia. A new start, far away from home perhaps, where he could enjoy a brand new beginning with someone else. Think about it. It makes perfect sense to me. You make a great point, Kitty, said Alicia, who was evaluating what Kitty was saying about her mother. You're right. If I'd known about my mother's gravesite, I'd have visited this town a long time ago. I think my father would have been grievously upset about that. I suspect it would bring the memories of how my mother died right back to him. That's maybe why he kept all this from me. He even advised me not to visit the small town where I was born. He said he didn't think it would be a good idea. Lily nodded. Well, I suppose grief affects us all very differently, does it not? I do know that after Ruth died, your father couldn't get away from this town fast enough. After that funeral, a few days later, he bundled you up in the back of his car with all your diapers and baby things. He left Primrose Cottage, organising for the estate agents to sell up the place at once, along with all its furnishings. He didn't want any of it. It brings me to my next question, Alicia. I do apologise for being so nosy, but does your father know you've returned to the small sleepy town where you were born, and that you've bought Primrose Cottage? Alicia paled. To tell you the truth, I'm terrified to tell him, Lily. I don't want him to know I've bought Primrose Cottage. Well, not yet. And I don't want to tell him I've returned to the small town either. Let's just say I don't think he'd be best pleased if he knew this, and that I was residing in the very cottage that he and Mum originally bought all those years ago. I know he's happily living in Australia on the Gold Coast with his new wife, and there's enough distance between us for him to assume I'm still living in New York. And my grandmother's agreed not to say anything about my move. But sooner or later I'm going to have to tell him the truth. I don't know how to even begin to tell him, I have to tell you. Oh dear, said Lily, heaving a huge sigh. You know what? Quit worrying about what your father thinks about anything, or about where you choose to live. This is your life, my dear. He's living in Australia, and by the sounds of things, he's a very happy man these days, enjoying a new life with his wife. I say good for him. But likewise, Alicia, I also believe that you should be living your best life. You deserve that. And if your coming to the small town ruffles your father's feathers, well, it's tough, isn't it? You came here because by the sounds of things you want to be close to your late mother's memory, and there's nothing wrong with that at all. And if there are people who don't like it around here, including the Tanners, well, it's tough luck for them all. That's what I say. Alicia was extremely thankful to Lily for being so understanding about why she had impulsively purchased Primrose Cottage and moved to the small town. She had spent several days and nights with Lily at her cottage, and Kitty would often regularly visit to have a chat. They were fast becoming close friends. Alicia had grown comfortable with both Kitty and her mother. She was not surprised that Lily had been her mother's best friend, as Lily wore her heart on her sleeve, and it was impossible not to like her. Alicia was very delighted with the progress the contractors she had hired to fix up Primrose Cottage were making, and by the looks of things they were doing a stellar, exemplary job. Primrose Cottage was slowly but surely coming back to life, rather like a perennial flower that dies back for the winter season, and in early spring it shoots through the ground, astounding everyone with its awe-inspiring beauty. Alicia could not believe how magnificent Primrose Cottage was looking, with its lilac front door and matching shutters, and the interior of the cottage was taking form, and she had seen the floors and staircase being brought back to life, along with a new kitchen that boasted marble countertops and elegant cupboards that had been fitted superbly. Alicia had underestimated how good Primrose Cottage would actually look, with a little tender loving care. The yard had also been transformed, and it was showcasing a variety of lilac, purple, blue and pale pink flowers in the yard. The locals in town on viewing the exterior of Primrose Cottage would shake their heads in a somewhat stunned stupor and say, "Well, I never! I can't believe how enchanting Primrose Cottage looks. The transformation is absolutely miraculous. Who would have thought it? I would have only thought a wrecking ball was good for the place." Again and again many of the locals were quite taken aback by the visible metamorphosis of Primrose Cottage, that appeared to have risen like a phoenix from the ashes, and was fast becoming a showstopper. Alicia had still not plucked up the courage to phone her father in Australia and tell him that she was now living in the small town in Primrose Cottage, the same place he and her mother had originally purchased all those years ago. She had a horrible feeling that if she were to tell him the truth, it might really upset him, as the memories of his late wife would all come back to him in vivid detail, and could potentially make his grief 1,000 times worse, as although he'd moved on from his old life, he'd never ever got over losing Ruth, and Alicia knew that her father adored his new wife, but in his eyes no one could hold a candle to Ruth. But he had found happiness and love with another, for he didn't want to be alone all his life, as companionship was extremely important to him, and Alicia was the very first to understand that. She was glad to be staying in Lily's cottage for the time being, until the renovations to Primrose Cottage were finally complete. It had been a wonderful opportunity to learn things about her mother from Lily, that her father had failed to share with her over the years, probably because it pained him to talk about her. So often when Alicia had asked her father questions about her late mother, her father would completely shut down, look melancholic, and say very gingerly, "Sorry, Alicia. It pains me to talk to you about Ruth. If you don't mind, I'd rather not discuss her. I don't want to be reminded about that part of my life." Her father's evasiveness had really annoyed Alicia to a certain extent, so all she could do was look over photographs of her mother and try and imagine what her mother's personality had been like. So coming to this small town had enabled her to learn more and more about Ruth Beckett. Alicia had been putting off going to the local graveyard, simply because there was a small part of herself that was almost afraid to see her mother's final resting place. But one morning she plucked up the courage and borrowed Lily's bicycle, which had a basket in the front, and she popped over to Errol Lancaster's shop first, as he sold flowers as well as groceries, and a selection of very fine produce, of course. His face lifted at once with pleasure to see her again, and when she told him she wanted to buy some flowers for her mother's grave, he also gave her an extra bouquet, courtesy of him and his wife, to lay at her mother's grave on his behalf. "Thank you for the bouquet. It's beautiful, Errol. Very kind of you." "No, it's a pleasure. I'm glad you can lay them at your mother's grave on my behalf. I appreciate it." "Well, the truth is, Errol, I've never been to the grave before. This will be my first time," said Alicia soberly. "I guess I've been afraid to go there. I've been putting it off. But I need to take the plunge. I need to do this. It's important to me." "Well, I suppose I can understand that," said Errol sympathetically. "But you may find some peace being able to see the stone where your mother was laid to rest. It can bring many people comfort, you know." "You're probably right," Alicia admitted. "Maybe it will bring me some peace." It didn't take Alicia long to cycle down the long dirt road. She took a swift turning to the right, and finally to the left again, and 10 minutes later there she was, cycling up the open wrought iron gates of the local cemetery. Errol Lancaster was right. The cemetery was a peaceful place. It didn't possess an airy, unwelcome energy. On the contrary, the energy was warmly welcoming. It was a fabulously beautiful morning, with a bright, energetic sunshine, wrapping its prisms of magnanimous warmth around her body in a generous hug. The graveyard was well maintained by the local townfolk, who took pride in keeping the cemetery looking extremely presentable, which was managed by a caretaker called Mr. Huggett. By the looks of things, Mr. Huggett also took pride in his job, for there was nothing forsaken about this cemetery. Alicia was somewhat surprised to find some of the stones in the cemetery went way back to the 1800s. Such graves were covered in moss and lichen, The names of the grave's occupants had long since been eroded by the passing of time. Some of these stones almost looked ancient. They were crooked and bent back, but all of them represented a soul that had lightly lived in this small town at one stage. But there were also modern gravestones on display, made out of a smart granite that twinkled in the sun. The graveyard was spread out over a wide, spacious area. The grass had been fastidiously mown, and beds of roses were ablaze with pretty, cheerful colours. They were obviously pruned in season and extremely well fertilized, for they filled the air with their scented perfumes. There were cobbled pathways through the graves for people to use as walkways to access different parts of the graveyard. Fringing the furthest edge of the cemetery was a dignified woodgrove of very imposing, tall, lofty trees. Some of them were ancient. Lily had told her that woodgrove stretched back for many miles, leading out to an old logging road that was no longer in use. Alicia parked her bicycle against a red brick building, situated next to a whitewashed cottage that probably belonged to the cemetery caretaker, Mr. Huggett, for outside the little cottage was a welcome mat, and she noticed in the window blue and white checked tweed curtains were swinging in a light breeze, and that was when she saw a black and white cat sitting on the window ledge, looking at her through curious large yellow eyes. The cat contentedly stretched out a paw and yawned. Alicia could see it was bathing in the morning sunlight. She tapped the window to acknowledge the cat. "Hello there! Aren't you a pretty thing?" The cat stared back at her for a second, and then began to lick its paw. Alicia didn't know where her mother's grave would be found. The cemetery contained so many gravestones, much more than she would have anticipated for a small town, but she would find it soon enough, she was most sure. Alicia was curious as to who was buried here, for it might give her a better understanding of the town's history. She could hear the pretty chirrups of the birds' song as she sashayed down the cobbled paths, and in the distance, in close proximity to the woodgrove, she saw what looked like to be a long, very burly but elegant column, the kind of grave marker you would expect to belong to a prominent, affluent family of great importance. It was surrounded by a large heart-shaped flower bed made up of yellow daffodils. It really was a spectacular spot to be buried, she thought. Alicia wanted to find out who the grave belonged to. Imagine her surprise when she realized that the extravagant gravestone actually belonged to her late mother. She stood there staring at the gravestone in bemusement. She was overcome with a deep sense of emotion. She bent down and put the bouquets of flowers on the gravestone, and was surprised to see a vase that had been laid down in front of the stone, displaying a pretty bouquet of fresh pink peonies. It would seem all these years later, her mother was still being remembered by folk in this town, and that was very touching indeed. On the grave, Alicia noticed was her mother's date of birth and date of death, engraved very glamorously in the elegant stone. Then she read the words, "Those we love don't go away. They walk beside us every day, unseen, unheard, but always near, so loved, so missed, so very dear." For a moment Alicia was tongue-tied by this. This was her mother's resting place. She could hardly believe it. She almost needed to pinch herself. She bent down and stroked the granite slab, very affectionately, almost as if it was her late mother's arm. It was like Alicia needed to get close to her mother, the mother she'd never known in life, and this was her perfect opportunity. "Mum, it's me. I can't believe I found your resting place. You've got the best, most beautiful tombstone in the entire cemetery. It's so grand. I honestly thought it belonged to a prominent family that once lived in this town, but it's yours. And better still, it's the only grave surrounded by daffodils, all in bloom. No one in this town has been able to forget you, Mum. Everybody remembers what happened that fateful day when Tommy Tanner ran you over." As Alicia spoke to her mother, a gentle wind whispered through the trees, almost as if responding to her words. "Mum, you probably know this already, but I've bought Primrose Cottage. I've moved into town. People have been so welcoming to me. Everybody is so kind. You're probably wondering why I came to town. The answer is, I don't really know. Not really. I guess I just thought coming here would make me feel closer to you. Seeing your resting place, Well, it's such a beautiful setting, isn't it? And it's very reassuring to me. I think being here I feel so much closer to you. I can't believe Dad never told me about this cemetery or about your tombstone. If he'd done so, I promise you I'd have visited you a long time ago. All of a sudden, Alicia, as she was saying these things to her mother, she heard a strange but curious shuffling sound. Alicia looked around, wondering where the sound had come from. That was when she saw it, a small, very cute, human-like black face, with the most adorable treacle-coloured eyes, taking a sneak look at her behind her mother's grave. She was so taken aback by this that her mouth dropped wide open. She wondered what it was that she'd just seen, for the head suddenly disappeared. And just as Alicia was beginning to second-guess herself and wonder if she'd seen anything at all, the human face appeared again and was looking at her mischievously. "Hello there!" Alicia called out, but the face vanished all over again. And when she peered curiously behind the gravestone, nothing was there. She couldn't help but feel bitterly disappointed. For a second she glanced towards the tall lofty trees that fringed the woodgrove. She was sure the owner of the face was shielding itself behind a nearby tree and watching her from a distance. Alicia, who was naturally friendly by nature, began to vigorously wave towards the tree. As whoever it was that had been peering at her, she knew had possessed a very unthreatening juvenile childlike energy. As to what it was, she couldn't be sure. She was about to make tracks from the graveyard when she saw a stranger walking towards her mother's grave, with a purposeful, intentional stride, his shoulders slumped forward. He looked to be in his early 50s, with a full head of snow-white hair and a white beard. He was wearing a red bandana on his head and a red and black plaid shirt, and in his arms he was carrying a huge bouquet of lilac roses. Before Alicia could say anything, the stranger stood still for a second and gawked at her, as if he was bewildered to find someone standing next to her mother's grave. The man's face suddenly paled. The colour was stripped from his skin. His piercing blue eyes widened in horror, and all he could say was, "No! Please, God, no! Ruth! Oh, my God, Ruth! Is that really you?" Then the unthinkable happened. The man fainted, collapsing on the ground in a heap, showering everything in a plethora of lilac petals, as a bouquet of roses was stripped from his hands, liberally scattering around him, and it would seem he was out for the count. "What the hell?" thought Alicia, scrambling hurriedly towards the stranger, dropping urgently to her knees, as she crouched over him, wondering what could have possibly caused him to collapse in the way he'd done. Had he had a heart attack, perhaps? A stroke? She didn't have her phone with her. She needed to call for help, but no one was around. Maybe if she knocked on the caretaker's whitewashed cottage, she could get help. That was the place she'd seen the cat cleaning his paws in the window. First, she needed to check the man's vitals to ensure he was still breathing. She reached for the stranger's pulse. She started slapping his face to try and bring him out of his comatose state. "Are you all right, sir? Are you all right? Can you hear me?" she said, her worried eyes staring into the man's face. Thank God he was breathing. She wouldn't have to give him CPR. The man opened his blue eyes in horror as he stared at Alicia and said, "Ruth! Ruth, is that you? It can't possibly be. It can't be. It can't be, can it?" Alicia suddenly realized the stranger, probably on seeing her, assumed he was seeing her mother's ghost. She smiled at the stranger awkwardly. "I'm not a ghost, sir. I'm real. You can pinch me if you like." The man sat up abruptly, lifting his upper back and head off the ground. He stared at Alicia with bemused eyes. "What the hell? Who are you?" he asked rather abruptly. "You look like the late Ruth Becker. Who are you? I thought you were Ruth's ghost. You gave me quite the scare. You look uncannily like her." "That's because I am Ruth Becker's daughter. My name is Alicia Becker." So we close on part 3 of our story. Tomorrow we proceed with part 4. And what a wonderful story it is. I look forward to you joining me then. Good night and God bless.